The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus departed from there and came to his native place, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What kind of wisdom has been given him? What mighty deeds are wrought by his hands? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his native place and among his own kin and in his own house." So he was not able to perform any mighty deed there, apart from curing a few sick people by laying his hands on them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I like that last line in the Gospel. He wasn't really able to do anything that great there, except he cured a few sick people and laid his hands on them. Like it's no big deal for Jesus. Of course, it isn't a big deal for him. But I want to focus on the second reading that we just heard from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And in this reading is one of my favorite passages from any of St. Paul's letters. And in it, he talks about how God has given him what he refers to as a thorn in his side. And he calls it an angel of Satan. And people throughout church history have tried to come up with different explanations for what Paul actually meant by this. But he doesn't say specifically what it is. So there's, speculation about what it might be. Maybe he's referring to a physical or a spiritual or an emotional affliction. And so I would say the most popular theories out there about this thorn in his side is that it was either some sort of temptation to a sin or some sort of physical problem like problem with his eyes or headaches or epilepsy or even a speech impediment. Nobody can say for sure because Paul doesn't say for sure what his thorn in the flesh was, but it was a real source of pain in his life. And Paul, the whole purpose of him telling us about this thorn in his side, this thorn in his flesh, is that there was a reason for it. And basically, it was to keep him from getting too full of himself. God's goal in allowing the thorn in the flesh was to keep Paul humble. And you can kind of see this throughout his writing if you put Paul's letters into the correct order. They're not in the correct order in the Bible. They're arranged according from longest to shortest, so you don't want to actually read them in that order. But if you put them in the right chronological order, you can see that he starts out his life as a missionary, as an apostle, pretty cocky and full of himself. And even he challenges other leaders of the church, the apostles, when he believes them to be wrong. But by the end of his writings, he is a much more humble man. He's even self-deprecating at times, saying that he is the least of Christ's followers. He really downplays his role in the church. And so it might sound strange, but it seems that Paul is saying that God allowed Satan to be a thorn in his side for his own good. Now, none of us likes to live in pain of any sort, spiritual, emotional, physical. And of course, Paul reasonably asks God over and over again, he says 3 times, to remove this thorn from his flesh, this thorn from his side. And he probably had a lot of good reasons for asking God to do that for him. He could have a more effective ministry. He would be able to reach more people with the gospel. He would glorify God even more if he didn't have to suffer this thing. But God wanted to teach Paul a valuable lesson that you don't have to be perfect to do those things. You don't have to be perfect to spread the gospel. Instead of removing the problem, God instead gave Paul more grace. He helped Paul out. He gave him a thorn in his side so that he might be reminded of his weakness and not grow too self-righteous or boast in his personal gifts. God gave him the thorn in his side so that he had to trust in God rather than in himself. And based off of just regular human experience, we all probably know that God is pretty good at this, that he is usually pretty good about letting us know what our weaknesses are. We work really hard, and sometimes our efforts don't pay off. We try and we fail. We get humbled by our mistakes. We get humbled by our weakness, our flaws. It's, in a way, humbling for me to stand in front of you every week and try to guide you and your families in the teaching of the faith, and because I'm not a parent. And many of you probably have a much stronger faith and relationship with God than I do. I'm just a regular human being, and I have a lot less experience at this whole faith thing than you do, believe it or not. My entire life, I've naturally been an anxious person. I hate public speaking. I love teaching, but I hate public speaking, and that's ironic. But you'd think that after 11 years of being a priest, you sort of get used to it. But I just don't like being in front of people, and it terrifies me. I have to do certain things to get myself mentally ready for every mass that I offer, and to prevent myself from having an anxiety attack. I'm sweating bullets right now, even though I have the air set at 65, so I'm sorry. But it's either me going to the emergency room or you being a little bit chilly. So I do have to rely on God all the time. That's maybe the flesh in my side as well. But God doesn't leave it there. God goes even further himself. He humbles us, but he also humbles himself. In the gospel today, Jesus goes back to his hometown, and he comes to the realization that a prophet is not accepted in his hometown, because he returns to where he grew up, and they just can't believe that he's anything special. Oh yeah, that guy, I grew up with him. He's Joe's kid. All of his relatives are still here. Some of them are right here in this crowd. But wait, what? He's claiming to be the Son of God? That's impossible. That's ridiculous, in fact. And it's been one of the hardest things to understand in human history, that the God we worship chose to take on weakness willingly. God, throughout history, is something that he's all-powerful. He can't be seen or comprehended or contained. In the Jewish tradition, you weren't even allowed to say his name without being struck dead. And to think that he would become a human being with human realities and human weaknesses, that's just plain the wrong idea of God, and that's what he reveals himself to be. Even in today's times, there's a great attempt to make Jesus less than God, to sort of grapple with this idea. People say that he was a good role model, or he's a great teacher, and he was just, in the end, misunderstood and was a victim of injustice. But God, that's hard to believe, because he was weak and he was vulnerable. And yet that's what God asks us to do, is to believe in that sort of God. And the reason for all of that is to show us that it's possible for us to be like him, to be holy. And it was his weakness that accomplished everything he set out to do. I know I say this all the time, but it's important to remember that all of the miracles and wonders that Jesus did, they didn't matter in the end. He was alone on the cross. All of the healings and exorcisms he did during his lifetime didn't really convince that many people that he was who he said he was. The people in his own hometown sure didn't believe, even in spite of all the mighty works he performed. But in the end, what was it that made them believe? It was the cross. That's when he did the most for us. It was when he could do the least himself. And that's why St. Paul says in today's second reading, power is made perfect in weakness. When we're weak, God shows his true power. So remember that when you're just sick and tired of carrying whatever cross it is he's asking you to carry. Remember that when you think what he's asking of you is impossible, that you can't do it. A priest afraid of public speaking. Think about that. And for some reason, God chooses us with all these weaknesses in mind, with all these shortcomings, and he probably chooses you because of those weaknesses. Today we celebrate, or this weekend we celebrate the 245th anniversary of our nation's independence, and we're reminded by God what true freedom means. And true freedom, despite what a lot of people will try to tell you, true freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. If we did what we pleased, then this world would be even more of a miserable place, because we would all be looking out for ourselves. Instead, God reveals to us through St. Paul that sometimes freedom means something even greater than what you want, something even greater than what you are comfortable with. True freedom is not doing as you wish, it's doing as you ought. And we do that through God's grace. God asks us to do things that our weaknesses normally wouldn't allow. In the end, it's not about your will. It's not necessarily about your plan. It's about what God has prepared for you, which is way better, by the way, than what you have planned. It's way more liberating and way more free than anything you can imagine. So in his personal revelation to St. Paul, Jesus said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." Our weakness shows just how great God's power is, because with his grace we can persevere in whatever he asks of us. My grace is sufficient for you. The grace that overcomes our weaknesses and failings. Power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I am content with weakness. For when I'm weak, then I am strong.